When I was taking some graduate courses out in California on preaching, one of the things that one of the teachers told us is that if you begin well and you finish well, that people will tend to forget a lot of the mistakes that you make in the middle. So I always try to make sure that I start well and finish well. Hopefully you'll forget some of the things in the middle. Same holds true for kings, it seems. Solomon started well. He was a young boy when he took over from his father David. He started in a marvelous way. We read how when God says, Solomon, my kingdom is yours. Whatever you want, no boundaries, no limits. Whatever you want, I'll give you. Now imagine that. God comes down and says to you, you can have whatever you want. What will you ask for? I heard somebody say that they might ask for a golf course that was their own. Somebody else might ask for millions of dollars or to be the largest lottery winner in history. Maybe somebody else would want new houses and boats and cars and all of this. But Solomon doesn't ask for any of that. Solomon only asked for wisdom, and very specific wisdom, that he might rule his people well. God is so pleased with Solomon that he gives him that and so much more. Solomon starts well. He looks out for the welfare of his people. But it's always how we get to the end of the race that also counts. You know, a fast start with a racer is good. But it means absolutely nothing if you never cross the finish line, whether that's in car racing or a foot race or any other race. Let me ask you this. How many of you know someone who woke up one morning and said, you know, I think today is the day that I am going to destroy my family by having an affair? Or maybe they got up in the morning and they said, you know, I think I'm going to ruin my business by embezzling today. Or they got up in the morning and said, you know, I think I'm just going to throw away my life and spend the rest of it in prison by going out and committing murder today. Anybody know anyone like that? Well, we all know people, don't we? Or at least have heard of them, who have done all of those things. And it seems that sin kind of creeps up on us. I don't know that Satan likes this head-on attack. If we can face sin head-on, most of us are pretty good at saying, no, I don't think I want to go there. Oh, come on, just one little murder. What'll it matter, right? We have the resistance to hold out against that. But when sin creeps up on us, then it becomes harder, doesn't it? A researcher by the name of George Barna is fond of telling the story of a frog in the kettle. It seems that if you take a frog, and I've never tried this, so please don't accuse me of cruelty to animals, because I've never done this. But it seems if you take a frog and you drop it into boiling hot water, that frog will immediately jump out. There's no surprise there, right? But did you know that if you put that frog in the water when it is just slightly warm and then continue to turn the heat up, that frog will become so comfortable in that warm water, like a tourist in a hot tub, I guess, that eventually they'll boil to death. So it was with Solomon. This sense of sin didn't just kind of come onto Solomon, it snuck up on him. And little by little, Solomon justified the little things that he did. And those little things became bigger things. And the bigger things became insurmountable. Until finally, in the end, Solomon is so far away from God that it's even hard to see where God lives any longer. But I want you to remember the upper story, first of all. The upper story is that God wants to call us back to him. The upper story is that God wants to live with every one of us forever. The upper story is that, like Solomon, God wants to come down and say to each one of us, and you can just kind of insert your name here, I want to give you anything you want, anything in my kingdom, anything that you desire. I want you to live well, to live happy, to be at peace, to be prosperous. But I want you to be my people. And God's the one that reneges on that, right? God's the one that pulls that back. God's the one that fails to hold out that promise. Or is it us? Do we keep falling into the Solomon-like mistakes, sins, failings, and continue to drop away from God? Solomon, in some ways, could be our model. And in other ways, I hope that he's not. Solomon started out asking for wisdom, not just for himself, but for all of his people. He wanted the kind of wisdom that he could exercise good leadership over all of those that God had entrusted. He wanted to take the kingdom that David, his father, had built and make it even grander, more prosperous, the envy of all nations, so that they too would come to know God. In fact, at one point in the story, it says that his nation was so prosperous, so rich, so abundant, that it became the envy of all the nations around it. And there was one particular celebrity that really was enamored with Solomon's wealth and Solomon's kingdom, and that was the Queen of Sheba. She'd heard of his wisdom. She heard of all this wealth. She heard of how prosperous this nation was, and she could hardly believe it, since she was living in a very prosperous nation herself. Was a very prosperous ruler. So she had to see it for herself. So she packs up a caravan filled with gold and silver and all kinds of good things, and she treks off across the desert and goes and sees Solomon and Israel. And it said that as she enters Israel, she looks around her and she finds that the nation is even more prosperous than she even imagined. And as she gets closer to the temple, the more prosperous it becomes. And finally, she meets Solomon. And she sees all the splendor and all the wonder of not only the kingdom, but of Solomon himself. She says, well, riches are one thing, but wisdom, well, that's another. So she puts his wisdom to a test. And it said that Solomon passes with flying colors. Imagine that kind of power, that kind of influence. And yet that's exactly what God wants us to have. And we throw it away. We don't wake up in the morning and start out saying, I think I'll throw away all the promises of God. What we do, we just climb into that lukewarm water of sin. And then let Satan turn the temperature up slowly, so that we don't notice it, so that we become comfortable in where we're at. And finally, it takes its toll on all of us. One of the things that Solomon wanted to do with his wisdom is he not only wanted it for himself, he not only wanted it to rule the kingdom, he wanted his people to have all of that. So he sets out to write down a lot of this wisdom. You have it if you want to read it. You can read a lot of Solomon's wisdom. It's called Proverbs. Take a look. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Rose had us reading Proverbs one year. 3 months in a row, we read one proverb a day. It's nice because there's 31, so it kind of works out nice that way. Almost works out to a perfect month worth of Proverbs. And after you read it 2 or 3 times, you discover there's a lot of wisdom in there. As we teach Dave Ramsey here,